All right, well, welcome back to our second supplemental training related to Native Americans or Indians, depending on what you're used to calling some of the people who are from North America. What I'd like to do is kind of shift gears a little bit and talk specifically about the Park Service and then about Mount Rainier in specific for the 6 tribes that are traditionally associated with Mount Rainier National Park. In August of 1916, President Wilson created the National Park Service. And again, that was part of the Department of Interior. And so Cassandra had talked quite a bit about this connection between the native tribes originally being under the War Department and eventually switched over to the Department of the Interior. And the National Park Service is also part of the Department of the Interior. So there was a really big connection, especially in terms of land, of Native Americans and national parks. So national parks are beautiful, but the way they were created isn't. All of the lands that were once inhabited by the Indian tribes, whose claims to ownership the federal government either ignored, invalidated, or did not recognize. So in Indian country, God's country, historian Phil Burnham described how many of America's most beloved national parks were carved out of land originally belonging to Native Americans or intended as reservations. These chunks of land were forcibly taken from the Native American communities that lived within them as part of the United States government's larger efforts to relocate and remove them. And Cassandra did a really great job of talking about the legalities of having them off of the land that we now appreciate as national parks. For Mount Rainier in particular, we talked about the Treaty of Medicine Creek that affected 4 of the tribes associated with the park. In 1855, the Treaty of the Yakamas for the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Indian Nation. It wasn't until 2000 that the Cowlitz Indian tribe gained federal recognition because they refused to sign those treaties. So what does that mean for us here at Mount Rainier National Park? I'm going to introduce Kevin Bacher, our volunteer program manager here at the park, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about Mount Rainier specifically.
And the only reason that I'm the person talking to you is because I've been here for 20 years, and so I've picked up a little bit over time about the history of Indians here in Mount Rainier National Park. I'm certainly not an expert either. But a lot of our history here in the park really follows from the earlier presentation, and so all of those things that were talked about Indian relations in the United States in general were happening here in Washington State and at Mount Rainier. When Lewis and Clark came across the country in 1803, 1804, 1805, they found a landscape that had been decimated by disease. The diseases had spread across the country. Their journals talk about floating down the Columbia River and seeing abandoned villages that were abandoned because the people who lived in them had all died, or most of them had. And so when my ancestors came out to the Pacific Northwest, they found an Indian population that was only a tiny fraction of what it had once been. And along with all of the legal issues, there was this perception that Indian populations were very small, that they were inconsequential. When people when early explorers came up into what is Mount Rainier National Park, they didn't see Indians up here. They didn't see a lot of evidence of Indians up here because those Indians were no longer at the populations that they once were, and were no longer following those traditional patterns of coming up and living here at Paradise in the summertime the way they once had. But not through choice of their own, but because of the effects of disease and the effects of the political climate and the Indian wars and everything else that had interrupted those patterns that had been in place for hundreds of generations here prior to that time. So when James Longmire, for example, well, let me back up just a little bit. When Philemon Beecher Van Trump and Hazard Stevens, Hazard being the son of Governor Isaac Stevens, who had ridden around the state with him on horseback, watching his father negotiate these tribes with the Native Americans. When P.B. Van Trump and Isaac Stevens summited the mountain in 1870, they did so with some guide service from a local Indian by the name of Slowiskin, and he was kind of an outlier. He was the only one that they really saw on their expedition up to the mountain. And so they, like so many other people, saw this as empty, unreserved land. When James Longmire came along in 1883 with an expedition to climb the mountain, also with P.B. Van Trump and some others, and then found the mineral springs at Longmire on the way back down, again, they did not see this really as Indian land. And so Longmire, who already had a homestead claim down in Yelm, followed the process that was described earlier and filed a placer claim, a mineral claim, for the land at Longmire based on the minerals that were in the spring there. And that's what he used to justify his claim of that particular patch of land that his family then built a hotel on and started attracting tourists up into the mountain. This is really the context in which Mount Rainier National Park was established in 1899. When you look at the efforts to establish Mount Rainier as a national park, there is very little in the discussions and the lobbying to make the national park that even references the fact that there were Indians here, that there was an Indian claim or an Indian history on these lands. And when the National Park Service was established and started talking about Indians here, there was a lot of misunderstanding that was part of that as well. Even when I started working as a seasonal national park ranger here at Mount Rainier National Park in 1994, our understanding of the Indian connection to the land here was just beginning to change, because up until that time, the prevailing idea of Indians at Mount Rainier was that this was a place that they came to rarely. This was a place that the mountain was considered sacred. The Indians were afraid of the mountain, that they would not climb the mountain because it was sacred and they were afraid of it, and there were spirits on the top of the mountain that would throw them off, and all of this other mythology that was really an American mythology and not the native mythology. There's a book, I should have brought it because I have a copy of it, that was really instrumental in this idea of what the native understanding of the mountain was, that was written in 1910, I believe it was. It was called The Mountain That Was God. So that was the framing of the Indian understanding of the land here, the mountain that was God, the God that they were all afraid of. And then in the early 1980s, the National Park Service did something really extraordinary, really radical, which is that they hired an archaeologist and a cultural liaison and actually talked to the Indians. This was really the first time that the park had done that, and actually asked the Indians, so what's your version of the story? Is it this book the mountain that was God, and basically the Indians just laughed and said, no, that's all BS. And so in more recent years, we've established new connections with the tribes, and we've started to listen to their stories about the mountain here and their side of the story. Now, another thing that was happening in early years of the park here is that once the park was established, there were still a lot of Indians that were using the park lands, because those treaties that had been signed back in 1854 and 1855 specifically said that the Indians could use unreserved lands for tribal gathering and hunting. And they saw the whole Cascades as unreserved lands. So over at Sunrise, for example, there were conflicts in the early years of the park between Mount Rainier National Park and the Yakima tribe, because they were coming into the park to hunt and gather and fish and graze sheep, as they had done before the establishment of the park. And the Park Service said, no, this is now national park land, you can't do that anymore. And so there was conflict, there was resentment between the National Park Service and the tribes, and the National Park Service, with the full weight of the federal government on its side, of course, prevailed in those arguments, but it created a lot of distrust between the National Park Service and the tribes, to layer on top of the general mistrust that already existed because of all of this history between the federal government and the tribal governments. So in more recent years, the process of rebuilding that trust and rebuilding the lines of communication and partnership between the Park Service and the tribes has been a slow and difficult one, with a lot of troubled history behind it. But the Park Service is really interested in improving those relationships, and the tribes are open to that. And so our relationships with the Nisqually tribe, the Cowlitz tribe, the Muckleshoot, the Yakima, all the different tribes that have histories here at Mount Rainier have slowly improved over the years through just constant communication and collaboration with the tribes. And so Marlene will talk a little bit about some of the things that have happened in recent years, things like setting aside places in the park for tribal use. Another one that I want to mention that's really significant is that Mount Rainier National Park has really been a leader in the idea of tribes retaining the right to traditional use in some ways of the land within the park. Again, this goes back to those treaties which said that the tribes had that right in perpetuity on unreserved lands. The operative term being unreserved lands. What are unreserved lands, and does that include Mount Rainier National Park? It certainly did at the time that those treaties were signed. But this became part of the national forests, and then it became part of the national parks in 1899. And so is Mount Rainier now still unreserved lands on which the tribes have legal rights, or is this now reserved lands on which they do not? And at what point did that happen without any input from the tribe? So one of our previous superintendents, John Jarvis, who went on to become the director of the National Park Service for many years during the Obama administration, was really an advocate for continuing some use of the park lands by the tribes. Not all of them. There's no hunting permitted, for example, here in the national park, but traditional gathering of berries and medicinal plants and things like that is permitted at Mount Rainier National Park, and that agreement is considered a template that a lot of other parks are exploring and implementing with their local tribes as well. Interestingly, there's been some research done on that as well. I just saw this a couple of years ago that our archaeologist here in the park worked with some researchers to actually evaluate in places where some of these medicinal plants were being gathered by tribal people following the traditional methods that they had followed for generations and passed down from generation to generation, and looking at the long-term effect on those plants and those places in the park versus other places where non-Indian people have been gathering the same plants illegally for florists, for example, or for illegal herbal medicine trade and that kind of thing. And they found that the places where non-native people were gathering those plants, those places were devastated. They would cut off the bare grass right at the base, for example, and then it would take decades to recover. They would pull the entire Pipsissewa plants, roots and all of the different runners, and those plants would just be gone. As opposed to the native tribes, which were only cutting parts of the bare grass, which were only taking certain runners of the Pipsissewa plant and leaving the others behind, and the researchers would come back the next year and they couldn't even tell where the Indians had been because those processes were sustainable. So that's just a really interesting part of the history that we have with some of the tribes here, particularly with the Nisqually tribe. And that brings us up to the present day, and I'll pass it back to Marlene.
I think sometimes we forget with the tribes being here in the area that all of them that are associated with the 6 tribes have access to the national park. They literally can pull up to one of our entrance stations, say that they are a tribal member, and they get in for free. And what we find is that a lot of the tribal members don't even know that. They don't know that they have the ability to access this land that we call Mount Rainier National Park for free. So if you happen to talk with anybody, please make sure that they know about some of their benefits of being a tribal member.
Is that a new thing?
It
Or
is.
when was that granted?
It's been many years. Yeah.
I believe that was something else
was part of the-
under John Jarvis was implemented.
What I'd like to do is just briefly talk about the tribes. And I took this information from their websites. And again, I don't want to talk for the tribes. This is in their own words. When you talk about the Cowlitz Indian tribes, they're the forever people. They strive to stay connected to the land, water, and Tamanawas to achieve a healthy, prosperous community for all generations. So thinking about the environment for everyone in the future. The Muckleshoot Indian tribe was actually, it's federally recognized, but they're descendants of the Duwamish and Upper Puyallup people who inhabited the central Puget Sound for thousands of years before the non-Indian settlement. And the tribe's name is derived from the native name for the prairie on which the Muckleshoot Reservation was established. Following the reservation's establishment in 1857, the tribe and its members came to be known as Muckleshoot rather than by the historic tribal names of their Duwamish and Upper Puyallup ancestors. The Nisqually people have lived in the watershed for thousands of years. According to legend, the Squalabsh, ancestors of the modern Nisqually Indian tribe, came north from the Great Basin, crossed across the Cascade Mountain Range, and erected their first village in a basin now known as Skate Creek. That might sound familiar to you. Just outside the Nisqually River watershed's southern boundary. Later, a major village would be located near the Michelle River. For the Puyallup tribe of Indians, they've lived along the shores of the Puget Sound in Washington State for thousands of years. The people of the Puyallup tribe have been known for generous and welcoming behavior to all people who enter our lands. Living off the waters of the Puyallup River fed by Mount Rainier, The people fished, hunted, and traveled by these waters, using the western red cedar to make many things like homes, utensils, and canoes. So again, Cassandra had mentioned between salmon and the cedar. The cedar really is known as the tree of life, and it literally has the most number of known uses of any plant in North America. For the Squaxin Island Indian tribe, they are the native people of South Puget Sound. They're descendants of the maritime people who lived and prospered along the shores of the southernmost inlets of the Salish Sea for untold centuries. Because of their strong cultural connection with the water, they're also known as the people of the water. And I apologize, the Confederate tribes and bands of Yakima Nation unfortunately are having some website issues at the moment. So I was not able to get information in their own words about the Yakima tribe. In terms of current cooperation between the park and these 6 tribes that are traditionally associated with it, we have the Cowlitz Indian tribe. Any enrolled tribal member may request free camping in one of 5 campsites in Luke Bay over in the Ohanakosh campground. And they do that online through their own tribal government. It's not in any way processed through the National Park Service. They do it through the tribal government, and the tribal government will let them know if it's available for the particular days that they want to be there. Similarly, for the Nisqually Indian tribe, any enrolled tribal member may request free camping in the Nisqually designated use area in the Longmire campground. Again, that's through their tribal governments, and there are a couple signs up in that area if you've ever gone over for the stewardship campground where you as volunteers are allowed to request camping. There's a section that's set aside specifically for the Nisqually tribal members.
There is some stones at the entrance to this area. What do they represent? Standing stones.
Oh, that's the memorial for the Rangers.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So what you're thinking about is for some rangers who've lost their lives while working here at the park.
Okay.
We also have place names that have specifically been passed down through generations that we use here in the Park Service. So Ohanakosh, or Ohanakosh in the Tainapam Upper Cowlitz language, translates as standing at the edge place and refers to the cliff edges of the bedrock gorge through which the Ohanakosh River flows. Have any of you been over to the Ohanakosh campground area? Yeah. You get a sense of, as you're up on top of the ridge looking down into the river, of how they created this name, this place name. One of the big things that took place, as Kevin said, in the history of Mount Rainier National Park is in place names specifically. And one of the things that the then superintendent said was we could retain tribal names for places as long as we were able to pronounce them and as long as they weren't too long. But as you look at some of the names around the park, we really did retain quite a number of native names from the different tribes and being associated with those areas. One of the other big things that just recently occurred here with the park and the tribes is to come up with this land acknowledgement And the land acknowledgement literally is a process whereby people who come in and are living on or using areas that have been traditionally and historically used by Native tribes, we want to acknowledge that. And so the National Park really worked with all of the tribes to come up with this land acknowledgement. I'm going to go ahead and read it because I really feel that this is very important for us. Administered as Mount Rainier National Park has been since time immemorial the ancestral homeland of the Cowlitz, Muckleshoot, Nisqually, Puyallup, Squaxin Island, Yakima, and Coast Salish people. By following elders' instructions passed through generations, these indigenous peoples remain dedicated caretakers of this landscape. Their traditional knowledge and management of this sacred land will endure in perpetuity, and we honor each nation's traditions of landscape stewardship in our endeavors to care for, protect, and preserve the features and values of the mountain. For those of you who are Meadow Rovers, this is exactly what we've talked about in our training about the mission we have of protecting these amazing lands that we call Mount Rainier National Park. When we talk about this timeline of history of between the United States and the Indians, between Mount Rainier and the tribes associated with the park, when we start to acknowledge the history and the current use by Native tribes, I think when Kevin mentioned there was this mythology that tribes don't use this land anymore. They're not of this land anymore. And that really has changed over time. That's kind of a mythology that we had in place of partly setting aside this property to become a national park. But now we're really starting to recognize that we are just the newest stewards of this land. And that's a really nice way to kind of think about that.
If anybody was curious, this has also spread. So I'm starting at UW in the fall, and this is now something that you actually have to go through and read and agree to upon entering the university.
Wow.
And it's the same with Seattle Central and like a few other colleges. So it's slightly different depending on what land the college is on, but this is actually spread to like other things in the state.
So thank you for sharing that, Keely. Yeah, it's amazing. For those of you who might be interested in more, we do have an upcoming event being hosted by the Nisqually Indian tribe, and it's specifically about native place names. So traditional names here in Mount Rainier National Park. It's going to be on Tuesday, August 2nd from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. And it's going to be in the Nisqually designated use area in the Longmire Stewardship Campground. It's open to tribal members, park staff, and the public. So again, as volunteers here at Mount Rainier National Park, you are actually park employees. So not only are you part of the general public, but you are employees, and you are more than welcome to come to this program. It's not any set agenda or time frame. To my understanding, you just show up if you're interested, and people from the Nisqually Indian tribe will be there talking about some of their history and knowledge of the area and why some places are called what they are in the Nisqually tradition. All right. So that's kind of all I have for the Mount Rainier portion of the Indians, what I'd like to do is transition over, and we have actually with us one of the park's seasonal archaeologists. Is that your title, Renata?
I'm an archaeologist here, yeah.
Oh, so you're full-time?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't even know that. See, I learn something every day.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to trade out the PowerPoints and have her come talk to us a little bit about the archaeology department and programs and what they do here at the park.